Oh, you're breaking the phenomenal-noumenal distinction. Right. You see? If there is indeed some sort of a pre-formation whereby the forming of the self is in the image of reality, you see, then by understanding the structures of the self, we can understand the structures of reality. And that's precisely what these people are trying to do. So the transcendental method is an attempt to provide a description of the process of self-understanding or self-consciousness, so that the development of the self-consciousness is a microcosm of the development of the consciousness of the absolute spirit, the all-inclusive ground of being. You see? And immediately I say that, you begin to see that this idealism is going to be a monistic idealism. There is one all-inclusive ground of being, you see, of which the self-consciousness is simply a microcosm. Now, let me back up with one more statement there. This may help. Back up to this. We've observed during the modern period from Descartes on and culminating in Kant, the ongoing question about the nature of the self. What am I? Oh, a thinking thing. Well, Locke isn't so sure. Hume finds only a bundle of perceptions with nothing to unify it. Kant finds that there is this synthetic unity of apperception, whereby there is some sort of unification of the field of consciousness. And the schematization of the understanding brings the unification of the whole of one's experience and thinking. But you notice that that is not an underlying substantive entity that is the unified self. It is the structuring of consciousness that is the unifier. Right? It's the structuring of the consciousness that's the unifier. Now that's the point of departure for the German idealists. They're not looking for some mind substance, some soul substance in the Cartesian sense. They're not looking for immortal souls in the Platonic sense that have some eternal pre-existence and so on and so forth. No. What they're doing is trying to understand the self as structured self-consciousness. You see? That's the notion of the self. What is it that unifies all of the diversities of experience? What is the unifying action of the self? You see? How are you going to characterize this self-consciousness? And as you see from what I've written on the board, if self-consciousness is the key to reality, and the question is, well, what is the essential, central, fundamental characteristic of self-consciousness, of which everything else is just a function or a byproduct? Then you get 4 different answers. In Fichte, moral consciousness. He takes off from the critique of practical reason. In Schelling, it's what Kant calls the teleological. In the critique of judgment, the aesthetic consciousness. Schelling is the major philosopher of German Romanticism. For Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, it's the religious consciousness. And Schleiermacher is the great 19th century theologian, building his theology as a projection of religious experience. You see. If you like, romanticism in theology. He's a romanticist theologian. And what Hegel does is simply to say, no, it's this conceptual capacity that we have. The ongoing process of trying to grasp the concept of being itself. You see. That's what marks the developing consciousness. So in trying to grasp more and more fully the concept of my self, I'm grasping more and more fully the concept of being itself, the totality. So you have to distinguish between the finite self and the absolute self. Absolute in the sense of the one all-inclusive ground of being. Okay, and this is where the phrase ground of being begins to pick up. You find it in Schleiermacher and Hegel and so forth. Okay, now let me pause there for question, comment. Kristen?
Oh, you answered my question as you were going on.
I figured I might, that's why I kept going.
Is the hinge point to all these, or it seems to me that one of the hinge points of all these idealists is that there is some sort of unity within the self.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the emphasis here is on the unity of the self, and immediately you've got a unified, all-inclusive one, absolute self. Yeah. So what you get here is a monistic idealism, a monistic metaphysic. Everything is ultimately one. Yeah. Built in this image. You're right. The unity of the self.
How is that different from, why do you say monistic as opposed to pantheistic?
Well, the term monism is simply saying reality is one all-inclusive being. Pantheistic is the religious shape that would take, identifying the one as God. Now, the term pantheism, we'll find, may be a little too heavy-handed for these guys, particularly for Hegel, who isn't happy with pantheism. But the term panentheism is perhaps more applicable. Now, the difference is the little Greek preposition en, which means in. So rather than saying everything is God and God is everything is in God, you see, but the totality of finite things does not exhaust the totality of God. There is room for more process. Yeah. Pantheism in Spinoza has a static universe. You see, it has the mechanistic static order. This is a dynamic, open-ended teleological process. David?
Yes, maybe comment on what you said between Kant and the German idealists, and you said that the Kant is the structure of consciousness as a unifier, and the German idealists, they kind of understand the self as a structure of self-consciousness. I didn't really catch the...
No, say that again. I'm not quite sure I got the question.
Okay. In your doctrine, I think you said that, according to Kant, it's the structure of consciousness that is a unifier.
Yes. Yes.
And then when you come to the German idealists, they're trying to understand the self as structured self-consciousness.
Yeah, in Kant, the unity of the self, which is this theme, okay, in Kant, the unity of the self is not found simply by listing forms and categories, but is found in terms of what he calls that synthetic unity, notice the term, synthetic unity of apperception. You see. And then the schematization of the 12 categories in relationship to the form of time. Now, notice in both cases, both the synthetic unity and the schematization, this is a functional unity. The self is unified in action. You see? Not in just being, but in thinking, in experiencing. That's why I say self-consciousness. You see? And I think that's important to notice that it's a functional unity. We're functionally unified, because what is the unifying factor in the self-consciousness in these cases? Well, this is the functional unity. These are the functional unities. You see? It's those functions which unify, respectively, for the particular philosophy. Reflect back into John Locke and his discussion of personal identity. You see, what is it which gives unity of the self through a period of time for Locke? And his answer is simply memory. That is to say, the past experiences which are associated with, in my present experience, my present memory of the past. You see, so that too is sort of a functional unity. And it's a somewhat speculative thing that he, as to whether there is an underlying soul substance, he rather thinks so, but can't prove it as clearly as Descartes thought he could. You see. So this notion of functional unity, I think, is important. Yeah. Okay. Anything else there? Let me sum this up then. What we're going to find is first a new scientific model, more organic and developmental. If you like, evolutionary, because of course evolutionary theory came in with the developmental biology. Developmental biology was at both the micro and the macro level. At the micro level, the beginnings of genetics. The macro level, evolutionary biology. But a new scientific model, developmental. A new philosophical method that begins with the transcendental method, but comes to be referred to as a phenomenological method. Phenomenology, that's the method. What is the title of Hegel's major work? The Phenomenology of Mind. The Phenomenology of Mind. And what is the dominant European philosophy in the 20th century? It is phenomenology, a methodological approach. It's the method underlying existentialism, underlying hermeneutical theory, and so forth. Now, watch this term, phenomenology. It is not the same as phenomenalism, and a moment's reflection will help you see why some of you who've been using the terms interchangeably